He thought he could humiliate her in his courtroom, make an example out of a quiet woman who didn't belong there. But he had no idea he was about to dismantle his own authority in front of everyone who mattered. The courtroom of District Courtroom 7 carried the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy, the kind that pressed against your chest like thick air before a storm. Marble floors reflecting the cold white lights above, polished wood benches filled with attorneys in tailored suits whispering behind leather folders, their voices low but sharp, like they already knew how this story would end. At the center of it all stood Sarah Mitchell, her gray cardigan simple, her posture straight but unassuming, her presence almost invisible if you weren't looking closely, the kind of woman people overlooked without a second thought, the kind people assumed didn't understand the language of power spoken in rooms like this. Judge Harold Whitaker adjusted his glasses as he looked down at her from the bench, his expression already edged with impatience, already deciding who she was before she had spoken a single word, his voice cutting through the silence with a tone polished by decades of control. Ms. Mitchell, this is a court of law, not a place for confusion or theatrics. And a faint ripple of restrained amusement passed through the room, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. Sarah didn't react, didn't shift, didn't lower her gaze the way most people would under that kind of pressure. She simply stood there, hands loosely clasped, her eyes steady, absorbing everything, every word, every tone, every glance exchanged between the attorneys seated just feet away. The case itself seemed small on the surface, a procedural dispute wrapped in legal language most people wouldn't question, but something about it felt off, like a detail slightly out of place in an otherwise perfect picture, and Sarah had noticed it the moment she stepped into the room. Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping once against the polished wood as if to punctuate his authority. "Do you have representation, Ms. Mitchell?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and found it amusing. And when she calmly replied, "No, Your Honor, I'll be speaking for myself," a few quiet chuckles slipped through the gallery before quickly being suppressed. The judge's lips curved just enough to register as condescension, not humor. "Very well," he said, drawing out the words as though granting permission for something trivial. "But I advise you to keep your statements brief and relevant." And there it was, the first cut, subtle but deliberate, designed to place her exactly where he believed she belonged. The room settled again, but not into calm, into expectation, the kind that waits for someone to fail, for a moment of embarrassment that confirms every assumption already made. Sarah glanced down briefly at the documents in her hands, not nervously, not uncertainly, but as if aligning pieces only she could see, her fingers still, her breathing steady, and for a moment, so brief it almost disappeared, something shifted in her expression, not fear, not hesitation, but clarity. Across the room, one of the junior attorneys leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, already disengaged, already convinced this would be over in minutes, while another flipped a page absent-mindedly, waiting for the inevitable misstep. Judge Whitaker straightened, preparing to move forward, to guide the proceeding toward the outcome he expected, his voice ready to close the gap between assumption and conclusion. But Sarah lifted her head just slightly before he could speak again, her eyes meeting his with a calm that didn't belong in that room, not from someone in her position, and though no one could have explained why, a faint, almost imperceptible tension began to ripple outward, like the first crack in something that had always seemed unbreakable, and without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she said, "Your Honor, before we proceed, there's a procedural detail I believe the court has overlooked." And for the first time since the session began, the room didn't react with amusement. It paused, just for a second, just long enough to feel the shift, just long enough for something unseen to begin unfolding. The words settled into the air with a weight no one had expected, and for a fraction of a second, Judge Whitaker did not respond, his pen hovering just above the paper as if the motion itself had been interrupted. Then he leaned back slightly, the faintest crease forming between his brows, not confusion, but irritation at being interrupted in a room where he controlled every second of movement and sound. "And what exactly do you believe this court has overlooked, Ms. Mitchell?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with skepticism, the kind that suggested he was allowing her to speak not because he needed to hear her, but because he expected her to reveal her own lack of understanding. A few heads in the gallery tilted, attention sharpening, curiosity replacing the earlier amusement, because something about her voice had not matched the role they had already assigned to her. Sarah did not rush, did not fumble for words. She simply adjusted the document in her hands and looked directly at the bench, her voice steady, calm, almost quiet, but carrying clearly through the room. The filing referenced in this proceeding was entered under an amended statute that took effect on January 15th of this year, Your Honor, but the court is applying the prior version, which was repealed. And the words did not come out like a guess or an argument. They landed with precision, like something already verified beyond doubt. A subtle shift moved through the room, small but undeniable, one attorney lowering his pen slowly, another glancing down at his notes, flipping a page with more attention than before. Judge Whitaker's expression did not change immediately, but his fingers tapped once against the desk again, slower this time, more deliberate. "I am quite aware of the statute, Ms. Mitchell," he replied, his voice tightening slightly. "And I assure you this court is applying the appropriate legal framework." But the certainty in his tone felt rehearsed now, not absolute. Sarah inclined her head slightly, not submissive, not confrontational, simply acknowledging the response, then continued, "Respectfully, Your Honor, the amendment included a procedural clause that requires reclassification of filings submitted within a 30-day window prior to its enactment, and this case falls within that window." And there was no hesitation in her delivery, no searching for words, just clarity. The room grew quieter, not forced, but natural, the kind of silence that happens when people begin to realize they may have misjudged something important. One of the senior attorneys in the second row leaned forward, elbows on his knees now, his earlier detachment gone, eyes narrowing slightly as he processed her statement. Judge Whitaker reached for the file in front of him, flipping it open with controlled movements, his gaze scanning quickly, then again, slower this time, as if verifying something he had not expected to need to verify. The shift was subtle, but it was there, the smallest fracture in the authority that had filled the room moments ago. "That interpretation is unconventional," he said finally, though the pause before the word lingered just long enough to betray uncertainty, and Sarah responded without raising her voice. "It is outlined in subsection C, Your Honor, page 4 of the amendment." And she lifted her document slightly, not as a challenge, but as confirmation. The junior attorney who had leaned back earlier now sat upright, his posture alert, his attention fixed completely on her, while another quietly reached for his tablet, scrolling quickly, searching. The room did not laugh this time. No one shifted dismissively. No one whispered, because something had changed, something none of them had anticipated. Judge Whitaker's eyes remained on the file, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he turned another page, and though he said nothing for a moment, the silence that followed was no longer his to control. It belonged to the truth that was beginning to surface, and for the first time since she had stepped into that courtroom, Sarah Mitchell was no longer invisible. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire room was waiting for someone else to restore the balance that had just been disturbed. But no one moved. No one spoke, and Judge Whitaker remained still behind the bench, his eyes fixed on the open file as though the answer might rearrange itself if he stared long enough. Then finally he closed it with a controlled motion and lifted his gaze back to Sarah, the authority still present in his posture but no longer absolute. "Even if that clause applies," he said carefully, choosing each word with more caution than before, "it does not invalidate the procedural standing of this case." And the statement sounded firm, but beneath it there was something new, something searching. Sarah did not immediately respond, and that pause, deliberate and unhurried, seemed to draw every eye in the room back toward her, her stillness no longer mistaken for uncertainty, but recognized as control. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet precision. "It does not invalidate the case, Your Honor, but it changes how it must be reviewed." And she lifted her document slightly, her fingers steady. Under the amended statute, the court is required to reclassify the filing before proceeding, which means the current motion cannot be ruled on until that step is completed. And the clarity of her explanation landed differently this time, not as a challenge, but as a correction. A faint shift moved through the gallery, the kind that could not be heard but could be felt, as attorneys who had dismissed her minutes ago now leaned forward, their attention sharpened, one of them quietly flipping through a printed copy of the statute, another scrolling more urgently on his tablet, the subtle tension building not from conflict, but from realization. Judge Whitaker's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers resting flat against the bench now, no longer tapping, as if even that small gesture might betray more than he intended. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that this court has proceeded prematurely." And though the words were framed as a question, they carried the weight of an admission he was not ready to make. Sarah met his gaze without hesitation, not confrontational, not defiant, simply certain. "I am suggesting the process has not yet followed the updated legal requirement, Your Honor." And the distinction mattered, not an accusation, but a statement of fact, and it left no easy space for dismissal. The room held its breath again, but this time it was different, not waiting for her to fail, but waiting to see how far she would go. In the second row, the senior attorney who had leaned forward earlier now exchanged a quick glance with a colleague, both of them recognizing something they had not expected to witness, while the junior attorney who had once leaned back now sat completely still, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet attention. Judge Whitaker shifted slightly in his chair, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if the room had not been watching so closely. And for a moment, his gaze drifted back to the file, then to the stack of documents beside it, as if weighing not just the argument, but the consequence of acknowledging it. The authority in the room had not vanished, but it had been challenged, not by volume or force, but by precision, and that made it harder to ignore. Sarah lowered her document just slightly, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, and she added, "If the court would like, I can provide the exact language of the clause." And the offer was not defensive, not hesitant. It was measured, controlled, and it shifted the dynamic in a way no one could quite explain, because now she was not reacting to the court, she was guiding it. For the first time since the session began, Judge Whitaker did not immediately respond, and that hesitation, however brief, did not go unnoticed. It settled into the room like a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed, something fundamental, and in that stillness, the realization began to take shape, not spoken, not declared, but understood, that the woman they had overlooked was not struggling to keep up. She had been ahead of them from the moment she walked in, and the gap between perception and reality was only just beginning to reveal itself. The silence stretched longer this time, no longer fragile but heavy, pressing down on every person seated in the courtroom as Judge Whitaker's eyes remained fixed on Sarah Mitchell, not with dismissal now, but with calculation, as if he were reassessing something that should have been obvious from the start. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. "Go ahead, Ms. Mitchell," he said, a simple permission that sounded very different from the condescending invitation he had offered before, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Sarah lifted her document fully now, her movements precise, unhurried, and began. Subsection C of the amended statute states that any filing submitted within 30 days prior to enactment must be reviewed under transitional classification guidelines before any procedural motion can be considered, and she paused just briefly, allowing the words to settle, not for effect, but because she understood their weight, which means this case should have been reclassified before today's proceeding was even scheduled, and the clarity of it landed like a quiet correction that could not be easily dismissed. A low shift moved through the room, not voices, not whispers, but the sound of people adjusting in their seats, papers being moved with more attention, screens tapped with more urgency, because now this was no longer a minor interruption, it was a structural issue. Judge Whitaker's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the bench, his posture still upright, still authoritative, but the stillness now carried tension, not control, and he reached again for the file, flipping to the section she had referenced, his movements slower this time, more deliberate, as though each page carried a consequence. In the gallery, the senior attorney who had been watching closely leaned even further forward, his expression no longer skeptical but intent, while another attorney quietly murmured something under his breath, a realization forming too late to remain unspoken. Sarah remained still, her eyes steady, not pressing, not pushing, simply allowing the facts to exist in the space she had created, and that restraint only amplified the shift taking place. Judge Whitaker scanned the document once, then again, and for a moment, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words followed, and that hesitation, brief as it was, sent a ripple through the room that could not be ignored. "This clause," he began, then stopped, adjusting his glasses with a measured motion that felt less like habit and more like a pause to regain footing, "does not typically apply in cases of this nature." He finished, though the statement sounded less like a conclusion and more like an attempt to hold ground that was beginning to shift beneath him. Sarah responded without raising her voice, without changing her posture. "It applies based on the timing of the filing, Your Honor, not the nature of the case." And there was no sharpness in her tone, no attempt to challenge his authority directly, just a correction that left little room for interpretation. The room went completely still, the kind of silence that follows not confusion, but recognition, and in that stillness, the weight of her words settled deeper than any argument could have forced. One of the clerks near the bench glanced quickly at another set of documents, then back at the judge, uncertainty flickering across his face before he quickly composed himself, while a younger attorney in the back exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible but somehow amplified by the quiet that surrounded it. Judge Whitaker leaned back slightly, his gaze no longer fixed entirely on Sarah, but shifting briefly across the room, as if aware now of the attention that had turned not just toward her, but toward him, toward his response, toward what he would do next. For the first time since the proceeding began, the power in the room was no longer one-directional. It was shared, balanced on a point that had not existed before she spoke. Sarah lowered her document just enough to rest against her side, her composure unchanged, her presence no longer invisible, and she said nothing further, because she did not need to. The argument had already been made, the detail already revealed, and now the silence itself carried the question that no one could ignore. And in that moment, it was no longer about whether she understood the law, it was about whether the court had overlooked it, and the difference between those two truths hung in the air, impossible to dismiss, impossible to silence, as every eye in the room waited for the answer. The weight of the moment lingered, thick and unmoving. As Judge Whitaker remained seated behind the bench, his authority no longer unquestioned but examined, not by defiance, but by precision, and for several seconds that stretched longer than anyone expected, he said nothing, his eyes moving once more across the file before him, then briefly toward the clerk seated to his right, a silent exchange that revealed more uncertainty than any spoken word could have. The clerk shifted slightly, glancing down at his own documents, flipping a page with restrained urgency, then another, his movements careful but no longer confident, and that alone sent a quiet ripple through the courtroom, because if the bench was uncertain, then everything that followed could no longer be assumed. Judge Whitaker inhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, then placed both hands flat against the bench as if anchoring himself. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his voice measured, but lacking the earlier sharp edge, "the court acknowledges your reference to the amended statute," and the phrasing was deliberate, cautious, as though each word had to be chosen with care. "However, interpretation of its application remains within judicial discretion." And though the statement attempted to restore control, it did not land with the same finality as before. Sarah did not interrupt, did not react visibly, but her eyes remained steady, and when she responded, her tone remained even, respectful, but unyielding. "Judicial discretion applies within the framework of the statute, Your Honor, not in place of it." And the distinction, though subtle, carried weight that settled deeper than any raised voice ever could. A faint sound of movement echoed softly as one of the attorneys shifted in his seat, the leather creaking slightly in the otherwise still room, while another leaned toward his colleague, whispering something too low to be heard, but the urgency in the gesture spoke for itself. Judge Whitaker's gaze flickered, just for a moment, toward the gallery, as if aware now that the room was no longer passive, no longer merely observing, but assessing, and that awareness changed the dynamic in a way he could not easily reverse. He reached again for the file, turning a page more sharply this time, then another, his movements revealing a growing tension he could no longer fully conceal. And when he spoke again, there was a subtle shift, not in volume, but in tone. "If what you are suggesting is accurate," he said, the words slower now, more deliberate, then the procedural sequence would require adjustment, and the sentence, though carefully constructed, carried the first trace of concession. The room did not react with noise, but with stillness, a deeper, heavier silence that settled over every person present, because they understood what had just happened, even if it had not been declared outright. Sarah lowered her gaze briefly to her document, then back to the bench, her posture unchanged, her composure unwavering, and she added, "It would also require that the current motion be set aside until reclassification is completed," and there was no emphasis in her voice, no attempt to press the point, just a continuation of logic that left no gap for dismissal. One of the senior attorneys in the front row exhaled slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition, while the junior attorney who had once leaned back now sat completely still, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet attention. Judge Whitaker did not immediately respond, and that pause, longer than any before it, carried a different weight, not resistance, but calculation, as if he were now considering not whether she was correct, but how to respond to it without fully surrendering the authority he had held so firmly at the start. His fingers tapped once against the bench again, slower, more deliberate, then stopped entirely, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed in a way that could not be ignored. "The court will take a brief recess to review the matter." And though the words were procedural, routine even, they carried an unspoken acknowledgement that the ground beneath him had shifted. No one moved immediately, no one spoke, because the significance of that moment settled slowly, unmistakably, and as the judge rose from his seat, the authority that had once filled the room completely now felt divided, no longer absolute, no longer unquestioned. And in that quiet, as Sarah remained standing exactly where she had been, composed and still, the realization spread through the courtroom, subtle but undeniable, that the woman they had underestimated had not just spoken, she had changed the course of the proceeding, and there was no returning to what it had been before. The courtroom did not erupt into noise when the judge stepped away. It did something far more telling. It held its breath, as if the absence of his presence had exposed something that no one had been prepared to confront, and in that suspended silence, the hierarchy that once felt unshakable now seemed uncertain, fragile in a way no one would have admitted out loud. Sarah Mitchell remained where she stood, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly against the document she still held, not gripping it, not fidgeting, simply steady, as though the outcome of this moment had never been in doubt for her. Around her, the room began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle, revealing ways. Attorneys who had once leaned back in quiet amusement now leaned forward, their attention no longer casual but intent, their eyes no longer dismissive but measuring. One of the senior attorneys adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Sarah, not with curiosity now, but with recognition, as if trying to place something that should have been obvious earlier but had gone unnoticed because of assumptions made too quickly. A younger attorney nearby flipped through his notes with urgency, then paused, his brow furrowing as he reached for his tablet, searching for the clause she had cited, confirming what he had not taken seriously minutes before. The shift in energy was undeniable. It moved through the room like a quiet current, altering the space without a single raised voice. Near the bench, the clerk who had earlier exchanged glances with the judge now reviewed the same documents again, slower this time, more carefully, his earlier confidence replaced by a focused tension, as if he understood that something fundamental had been missed. No one spoke to Sarah directly, but the way they looked at her had changed completely. The invisible barrier that had once separated her from the rest of the room had dissolved, replaced by something more complicated: respect, uncertainty, and a growing awareness that she was not who they had assumed she was. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, stretched by anticipation, and when the side door behind the bench finally opened again, the sound alone drew every eye forward, the quiet returning instantly, sharper now, more focused. Judge Whitaker stepped back into the courtroom, his expression composed, but not identical to the one he had worn before. There was a tightness around his eyes now, a controlled awareness that had not been there earlier, and as he took his seat, the room settled into stillness once more, waiting. He placed the file in front of him, adjusted it with deliberate precision, then looked out across the courtroom, his gaze sweeping briefly before landing on Sarah, and this time, he did not look at her as if she were out of place. He looked at her as if she mattered to what came next. After reviewing the applicable statute and the timing of the filing, he began, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that had not been present before. The court acknowledges that the amended provision cited by Ms. Mitchell is indeed relevant to this proceeding, and the words did not echo loudly, but they did not need to, because their meaning landed with clarity that could not be softened. A quiet ripple passed through the room, not audible, but visible in the shifting posture of those present, in the exchanged glances that no one tried to hide anymore. Sarah did not move, did not react visibly, but her stillness now carried something different, not tension, not anticipation, but quiet confirmation. Judge Whitaker continued, his tone controlled, but unmistakably altered. As such, the current motion will be suspended pending proper reclassification under the updated procedural guidelines. And with that, the structure of the proceeding changed completely, not through confrontation, not through force, but through precision. He paused briefly, then added, "The court appreciates the clarification, and though the statement was formal, measured, it carried something more beneath it, something that had not existed when the session began." The room did not react with applause or sound, but the silence that followed was no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. It was clear, defined, and in that clarity, the shift was complete. The woman who had walked into the courtroom unnoticed now stood at its center, not because she demanded attention, but because she had earned it without ever raising her voice. The words did not echo, but they settled into the room with a finality that could not be undone, and for a brief moment, no one moved, as if the entire courtroom needed time to adjust to a reality that had quietly rewritten itself. And Sarah Mitchell remained exactly where she stood, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, not triumphant, not relieved, simply steady, as though the outcome had always been a matter of process rather than victory. Around her, the shift in perception continued to unfold in subtle but unmistakable ways. Attorneys who had once avoided meeting her eyes now glanced toward her openly, some with quiet respect, others with a curiosity edged by humility, as if they were reassessing not just her, but their own assumptions. The senior attorney in the front row leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose as he closed the folder in his lap, not dismissively, but thoughtfully, as though acknowledging something that required no words. Nearby, the younger attorney who had once leaned back in quiet confidence now sat forward, his hands clasped loosely, his attention still fixed on Sarah, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet recognition that he had witnessed something rare. Judge Whitaker adjusted the papers in front of him once more, but the movement lacked the earlier rhythm of control. Now it felt deliberate, measured, as if each action carried awareness, and when he spoke again, his tone was different, not diminished, but refined. "The court will reconvene once the reclassification process has been completed," he said, his voice steady, but stripped of the earlier condescension. And though the words were procedural, they carried an unspoken acknowledgement that the direction of the case had been altered. He paused briefly, then added, "Ms. Mitchell, you will be notified accordingly." And even that simple address, using her name without the earlier edge, marked a shift that did not go unnoticed. Sarah inclined her head slightly, not as submission, but as acknowledgement, and for the first time since the session began, her presence in the room felt fully recognized, not as an outsider, but as a participant whose voice carried weight. The clerk beside the bench made a few quick notes, his pen moving with renewed focus, while another staff member gathered documents with more care than before, the atmosphere no longer casual, no longer dismissive, but attentive, precise. One by one, people in the gallery began to move, quietly collecting their belongings. But even as they did, their attention lingered, glances cast back toward Sarah, as if confirming what they had just witnessed was real. No one approached her, no one spoke directly, but the silence around her had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with recognition. As the room gradually shifted toward its conclusion, The weight of what had happened remained, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, a quiet correction that had reshaped the space without confrontation. Sarah turned slightly, gathering her document with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning. And as she took a single step back from the center of the room, the marble floor beneath her echoed softly, the sound clear in the now settled silence. There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, only a stillness that spoke louder than any noise could have. And in that stillness, the lesson settled deeply, not declared, not announced, but understood by everyone present, that authority without attention can falter, and that truth, when spoken with clarity, does not need volume to be heard. It only needs the courage to stand where it is least expected. The courtroom did not empty all at once. It dissolved slowly, like a moment people were reluctant to fully leave behind. And even as chairs shifted and quiet footsteps echoed across the marble floor, the weight of what had just happened remained suspended in the air. Subtle but undeniable. Sarah Mitchell moved with the same calm precision she had carried from the moment she entered, gathering her papers without haste, aligning each page carefully as though the order itself mattered, not because anyone was watching, but because it reflected who she was. A few attorneys lingered longer than necessary, their conversations hushed, their glances drifting back toward her with a curiosity that had replaced their earlier indifference. One of them, a man in his late 50s with silver at his temples, adjusted his tie and stepped slightly closer, not enough to intrude, but enough to acknowledge her presence, his voice low and measured as he said, "That was exceptionally precise." And though the compliment was understated, it carried a sincerity that did not need elaboration. Sarah met his gaze briefly and gave a small nod, not basking in the recognition, not dismissing it either, simply accepting it without attachment, and that quiet response seemed to say more than words could have. Across the room, the younger attorney who had once leaned back now stood with his tablet still in hand, staring at the statute he had finally pulled up, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and respect, as if the clarity of the text now made him question how he had missed it before. Near the bench, the clerk continued organizing documents, but his movements were slower, more deliberate, his earlier certainty replaced by careful attention, and every so often, his eyes lifted briefly towards Sarah, not with authority, but with awareness. The side door remained closed now, the judge no longer visible, but his absence felt different than before, no longer commanding the room, but leaving behind a space that had been reshaped by what had occurred. Sarah turned slightly toward the aisle, her steps measured, her shoes making soft, steady contact with the polished floor, and as she moved, the subtle hum of conversation around her seemed to quiet just a fraction, not because anyone asked for silence, but because attention followed her naturally now. She reached the edge of the aisle and paused for a brief moment, adjusting the strap of her simple bag. Over her shoulder, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the shift in perception around her. Behind her, a quiet exchange between two attorneys carried just enough to be heard. She cited it exactly. One whispered, and the other replied, "Page 4, subsection C." Their voices low but filled with a recognition that had come too late to change what had already happened. Sarah did not turn back, did not acknowledge the words, but the stillness in her posture suggested she had heard them, not as validation, but as confirmation of something she already knew. As she continued toward the exit, the tall wooden doors at the back of the courtroom came into view, sunlight filtering faintly through the narrow glass panels, casting soft lines across the floor, and with each step, the space behind her seemed to settle into a quieter, more reflective state. There was no dramatic exit, no final statement, only a calm departure that left behind a room altered not by force, but by truth. And in that lingering silence, as the last of the observers gathered their belongings and the echoes of footsteps faded, the realization remained, quiet but permanent, that respect is not commanded by position, it is revealed through clarity, and once revealed, it cannot be taken back. The heavy wooden doors closed behind Sarah Mitchell with a soft, measured sound that echoed briefly through the hallway before fading into the quiet of the building. And for a moment she stood just outside the courtroom, the polished floor stretching ahead, the distant murmur of other proceedings barely reaching her, as if the world beyond that room had continued uninterrupted. unaware that something inside had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. She adjusted the folder in her hands, aligning the edges once more out of habit, not necessity, her movements calm, controlled, untouched by the attention she had left behind. And then she began to walk, her pace steady, neither hurried nor lingering, simply moving forward with the same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning. Behind those doors, the courtroom continued to settle, conversations resuming in low tones, but different now, no longer filled with casual assumptions or quiet amusement, instead shaped by reflection, by the subtle discomfort of realizing how quickly judgment had been formed and how completely it had been undone. The senior attorney who had spoken to her earlier remained seated for a moment longer than the others, his gaze resting on the now empty space where she had stood, his expression thoughtful, as though he were replaying each word she had spoken, not to challenge it, but to understand how easily it had been overlooked. The younger attorney closed his tablet slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly, the tension of realization replacing the confidence he had worn so easily before, and though he said nothing, the lesson had already taken root, quiet but lasting. Near the bench, the clerk gathered the final documents with care, his earlier movements replaced by a deliberate attention that suggested something had shifted in him as well, not authority, but awareness, and every page he touched now carried a weight it had not held before. Judge Whitaker remained in his chambers, out of sight, but not untouched by what had occurred, the echo of that moment lingering beyond the courtroom walls, not as a challenge to his position, but as a reminder of its responsibility, a realization that precision demands attention, and that even authority must answer to truth when it is clearly presented. Outside, Sarah reached the end of the corridor, where sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long, quiet shadows across the floor, and she paused only briefly, not to reflect on what had happened, but simply to step into the light before continuing forward, her figure steady, unremarkable to anyone who might pass her, just another person moving through an ordinary day. There was no crowd waiting, no recognition beyond that room, and yet the impact of what had happened did not depend on witnesses. It remained where it mattered, in the minds of those who had seen it, in the quiet shift of understanding that would follow them long after the details of the case had faded. And somewhere between the silence she left behind and the calm with which she walked away, a truth settled into place, not spoken, not announced, but unmistakable in its presence, that power may shape a room, but clarity reshapes it. And on that day, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, Sarah Mitchell had reminded everyone present what dignity looks like when it stands its ground.